Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. Morality and storytelling is a very fraught subject for reasons I've discussed before on this channel. Deliberate attempts to include it often come off as preachy, and yet many things in life are moral questions, and characters have to have morals or they come off as sociopaths. Balancing the need of writing moral actions in a story without coming off as preachy is a very difficult thing to do. I've spoken before about the ways I approach these questions in the videos Othello Morality and The Moral Mosaic. And I really haven't changed my mind too much about the basic techniques I lay out there. I still think they're very useful, but they're very broad, and sometimes I find it useful to have simpler ways of looking at characters, especially characters that aren't going to have a lot of screen time, to determine exactly how morally complex they are. Of course, not every character needs to be morally complex. Again, if they have very little screen time, so to speak, they may not need a whole lot of moral complexity. Also, the character themselves does not have to be super complex to be morally complex. A great example of a character who is very simple, but still very morally complex, is Monkey D. Garp from One Piece. Probably the most morally complex character in the story. He wears a lot of hats. He's a father and a grandfather and a marine. And he's a mentor. He's a man who believes in freedom. He possesses immense loyalty to the people he loves and trusts. In short, he wears a lot of hats besides the bulldog. And as we see him transfer between those hats, we get a very good idea of who he is and what it means to try and juggle all of these roles. Vice Admiral Garp is far outside the scope of the analysis in this video, though. I want to take a look at a simpler example of what I call changing hats, and how it helps us understand a morally complex character who doesn't necessarily appear on screen a great deal. So, El Dorado is a 1966 film starring John Wayne as the gunfighter Cole Thornton. There's a lot of machinations in the story of El Dorado that really aren't important to what I want to talk about here, because Cole is not actually the example of this technique. Cole is a white hat cowboy, and he's very morally simplistic. He does the right thing in just about every situation where there is a right thing to be found. Not that there always is, which is, in fact, an important part of the movie, but again, not what I want to discuss. What I'm actually interested in is the black hat that plays opposite Cole, Nelson McLeod. McLeod is our black hat for the show. However, our introduction to him is very interesting. We're introduced to McLeod through the eyes of Mississippi, or Alan Badillion Traherne, but I'm just going to call him Mississippi, like everyone else. Mississippi is just a kid who rides in off the range, wearing a kind of dorky-looking green hat, and out for blood. McLeod is riding with 3 other guys on his way to take up a job that Cole Thornton has just turned down. There's a lot of signs that he's our bad guy right off the bat. Before there's even any dialogue with him, there's the fact he's wearing a black hat, which is, of course, a big piece of symbolism in this kind of story, and the fact that he's lost an eye and has a scar on his face from some previous fight. He's a very tough, hard man, and we can tell that just by looking at him. However, Mississippi approaches his group with no concerns, even though he's not armed, at least so far as we can see. Mississippi addresses himself to Charlie Hagen, which is one of McLeod's 3 flunkies. Once he confirms he has the right man, Mississippi takes off his hat and asks Hagen if he recognizes it. Charlie doesn't, and asks if he should, at which point Mississippi points out maybe because he killed the man it belonged to. Johnny Diamond was an old man and a bit of a gambler, very good at his craft. But a couple of years back, he took a little bit too much money from Hagen and 3 other people. These 4 men accused Johnny of being a cheat, and they killed him. We get all of this backstory in a very short back and forth between Hagen and Mississippi, at which point McLeod intervenes. And he gives Charlie a nasty look, and he says it shouldn't have taken 4 of you. It is at this moment that McLeod goes from being a black hat to being a judge. The color black embodies them both, because they both carry the threat of death. And a death sentence is exactly what he gives Charlie. Mississippi caught up with the 3 other guys who killed Johnny. Now he's ready to finish things with Charlie. Now, this could turn into a 4-on-1. There's 4 people seated at that table, after all, and Nelson McLeod is a gunslinger, just as famous and just as fast as Cole Thornton. Mississippi tells Hagen to stand up, asking to do things one-on-one. And McLeod agrees with him. After all, he says, it shouldn't have taken 4 of you. Charlie stands and tries to draw his gun, but before he can get it over the table, Mississippi has produced a concealed knife and throws it into his throat, killing him. One of McLeod's other flunkies tries to kill Mississippi in retaliation, but it is at this point that Cole Thornton actually intervenes and breaks up the potential fight. McLeod, the only one who hasn't tried to get in on this action so far, tells his men to bury Charlie Hagen. Then he comments to Thornton that it always takes more than one, to which Thornton replies, that's because they're no good. From there, McLeod returns to the Black Hat. He offers Thornton a position, but Thornton turns it down. He's already turned down the job that McLeod is on. In his turn, Thornton warns McLeod that his employer is no good, but they don't see eye to eye and they part ways. Of course, eventually they will meet at the climax of the movie, but outside of this brief encounter, we don't really get a lot of characterization for McLeod. However, it still shows us a morally complex character. Yes, he's a mercenary. He makes his living from violence. We know he's on his way to take up a job to throw some innocent people off of land they have spent years developing so that a big land baron can move in and take it over. Okay, well and good. But we also see that he has no love for cowards. Judge McLeod does not condemn Charlie Hagen to death because he killed a man. He condemns Hagen to death because it took 4 of them. They were cowards who had to gang up on someone in order to get their way. He's clearly disgusted by that. He doesn't think much of the 2 men who tried to gang up on Mississippi afterwards either. On the other hand, he shows a great deal of respect for Cole Thornton, not only because he demonstrates excellent shooting skills in this encounter, and not only because he has a reputation that matches those skills, but because he had the guts to step in, even though he knew he was outnumbered and only backed up by, let's face it, a fairly green-looking kid. I mean, he even has a green hat. Color symbolism in Westerns, not always subtle. In a good bit of narrative irony, McLeod's own judgment will rebound on him in the climax of the film, because Bart Jason, the man he's about to take a job from, is just building up a crew of mercenaries to gang up on a small family. Jason is no good, just like Charlie Hagen was. So when Thornton shoots McLeod at the end of the film, it feels very much justified. Not only by a general sense of morality, but by McLeod's own sense of morality. It's a very interesting arc for a morally complicated character that has very simple motivations and doesn't get a lot of screen time. However, if we only saw McLeod in the role of a mercenary gunslinger, we would never see this more complicated side to the character. And Judge McLeod is only on the screen for 3 or 4 minutes of a 2-hour movie. It's very efficient and very interesting characterization. It also serves to introduce us to an important character. Mississippi goes with Thornton on the rest of the adventure, and he's a very pivotal character in many of the things that play out afterwards. We get a strong sense of his character, his drive for justice, and his determination in the face of very daunting odds. And of course, we've known Thornton for a little bit at this point, but we clearly see that intervening on behalf of the little guy is baked into who he is, and he is eventually going to go back to the town he left and stop Bart Jason's depredations on the McDonald family. So it's not like this time is just set aside for the character of Nelson McLeod. It's very efficient storytelling going on here in all directions. But the important thing here is that we do see McLeod temporarily step out of his primary role in the story and become something else entirely. That helps us understand him better, and it's one of the techniques I've learned that helps me understand my own characters better. Hopefully, it will help you as well. Now, you don't necessarily have to incorporate every aspect of a character that you consider as you are writing them into the narrative itself. For example, if I were the person who wrote El Dorado And in the process of writing it, I thought to myself, maybe Nelson lost a brother or his wife because he was around a coward, and this is why he hates cowards so much. That would be another example of my putting a different hat on the character to help me understand their moral character with more clarity. But I wouldn't necessarily write it into the story in that way. I could simply write the Mississippi scene and cut out that bit of backstory. So clearly there's a lot of complexity to how you can use these techniques to develop a character versus how you use these techniques to paint a character over the course of a narrative. And of course, looking at these characters in these different lights is a great way to develop an Othello approach to morality, flipping things back and forth to look at them from different points of view and how different actions may have different consequences depending on the circumstances they are taken in, getting you that sense of the push and pull that can eventually expand out into a very rich and nuanced moral mosaic if your character has a bigger role to play in a story. Of course, if they don't, or if they're fairly important but they're not going to be actually on screen a great deal, it can just be a good way to illustrate a character for the audience, as we see with Nelson McLeod. However you use it, I hope the technique of changing hats will help you to build a better sense of the richness and nuance characters can have in moral storytelling. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.